Hey there, future workforce of America. Want to go to college and maybe, just maybe, afford to get out of debt one day? Then you better get cozy with the Internal Revenue Code, specifically Section 221, D1. This little gem defines what counts as a qualified education loan. Sounds simple, right? Well, buckle up, Buttercup, because the world of student loans is about as straightforward as a bowl of spaghetti wrestling a porcupine. This section of the tax code is the gatekeeper to the American dream, or at least the version where you get a degree and a side of crippling debt. It's the foundation upon which a multi-trillion-dollar industry is built. And let me tell you, business is booming. But hey, at least you can deduct the interest on your taxes, right? Because that totally makes up for the soul-crushing weight of debt you'll be carrying for the next 3 decades. Remember the good old days of 2005? Okay, maybe not. George W. Bush was president. Crank That, Soldier Boy, was topping the charts. And Congress decided it was the perfect time to make bankruptcy even more miserable. Enter the Bankruptcy Abuse Prevention and Consumer Protection Act, or BAPCPA for those who enjoy acronyms that sound like a dying walrus. This delightful piece of legislation made it significantly harder for everyday folks to file for bankruptcy. But it reserved a special circle of hell for student loan borrowers. See, before BAPCPA, you could, in theory, discharge your student loans through bankruptcy if you could prove undue hardship. After BAPCPA, well, let's just say the bar for undue hardship got higher than Snoop Dogg at a Willie Nelson concert. So, what exactly is undue hardship? Good question. It's basically the legal equivalent of winning the lottery while simultaneously being struck by lightning, twice. You have to prove that you're basically incapable of holding a job, paying your bills, or even functioning as a semi-normal member of society. All because of your student loans. And even if you somehow manage to convince a judge that your life is a Dickens novel set to the soundtrack of your financial despair, there's no guarantee your loans will be completely discharged. You might get some temporary relief, but good luck escaping the clutches of the student loan industrial complex that easily. They've got lawyers, lobbyists, and enough legal jargon to make your head spin faster than a top at a physics convention. Interestingly enough, under 34 CFR section 685.212, the Secretary of Education is required to discharge one's student loan debt if the borrower dies. Clearly, this provision is against public policy for promoting self-deletion as the only meaningful means for having one's student loan debt discharged. The gag is that students are prevented from taking advantage of this provision because states have simultaneously deprived citizens of the right to die. Now you might be thinking, hold on a minute, doesn't the Constitution require Congress to establish uniform bankruptcy laws? And you'd be absolutely right. Article 1, Section 8 of that beautiful document clearly states that bankruptcy laws should be the same across the land. As a threshold matter, Congress gave special economic protection to student loan creditors, which was not given to other creditors. This is unconstitutional. Bankruptcy laws are required to apply to all creditors within the same class uniformly. That is, creditors of unsecured debt are supposed to be treated exactly the same. Student loan creditors shouldn't be given any more protection than creditors of credit cards. What's worse, Congress never defined the term undue hardship under the Federal Bankruptcy Code, leaving individual federal circuit courts to define it for themselves. This is also unconstitutional. Under the Constitution, Congress, not federal courts, have the sole authority to define federal bankruptcy law. Additionally, legislatures are required to give the public proper notice of its laws and how they should be applied. If Congress fails to give proper notice of its laws and how they should be applied, courts are required to strike them down as unconstitutional under the void for vagueness standard. So we have 3 main problems here that make the student loan provisions under the Federal Bankruptcy Code unconstitutional. Number 1, the term undue hardship was never defined by Congress and should have been struck as void for vagueness. Secondly, courts do not have the power to define bankruptcy laws. Third, Bankruptcy provisions that apply to the discharge of students are unconstitutional because they are not being applied uniformly but have been left to the discretion of individual circuit courts. So while the intention might have been to create a level playing field for debtors, the reality is anything but. Section 5. A system designed for anything but a fresh start. The current bankruptcy system, especially when it comes to student loans, is about as far from uniform as you can get. It's more like a patchwork quilt sewn together by a blindfolded squirrel on a caffeine bender. Some judges are more lenient than others. Some states have their own quirky interpretations of the law. And the whole thing feels like it was designed to keep you trapped in a never-ending cycle of debt and despair. And that whole fresh start thing that bankruptcy is supposed to provide? Yeah, good luck with that. Imagine filing for bankruptcy, wiping the slate clean, only to realize you're still shackled to tens of thousands of dollars in student loan debt. It's like being released from prison, but having to wear an ankle monitor for the rest of your life. Section 6. The education industrial complex making bank off your broken dreams. Now, let's talk about the real winners in this whole student loan debacle, the education industrial complex. We're talking about the colleges and universities that keep jacking up tuition rates faster than a teenager's heart rate at a Taylor Swift concert. We're talking about the lenders who are more than happy to shower you with money when you're young and naive, only to come knocking with their hands out and interest rates through the roof a few years later. These institutions have spent decades lobbying politicians, influencing policy, and generally rigging the system in their favor. They've created a system where education is treated like a commodity, and students are seen as nothing more than walking, talking ATMs. Section 7. Occupational licenses. You took out student loans due to government coercion. Now, you're supposed to take personal responsibility and pretend that this is all your fault. While in elementary school, we were all indoctrinated with the notion that if we didn't go to college, we would spend the rest of our lives flipping burgers. After obtaining higher education, many of us still ended up flipping burgers or working jobs that only required a high school education. What's worse is the fact that the only reason that many of us attended higher education in the first place is because the government required us to attain degrees as a prerequisite for obtaining occupational licenses. Without obtaining an education from a government-approved institution, we would not be allowed to work in our chosen trades. Even after playing by the government's rules and obtaining an education, the government still prevented many of us from earning a livelihood in our chosen trades by denying us occupational licenses. It's a sadistic cycle of bait and switch, moving the goalpost and pay to play. The only winners are the people who are already sitting pretty at the top. Occupational licenses do not protect the public, but were created as barriers to entry to protect current practitioners from economic competition. If the matter were left to the free market, many of us wouldn't have gotten into debt in the first place. Yet, libertarians can't seem to wrap their brains around the cancellation of student loan debt, even though it was the government that created the problem in the first place. I guess personal responsibility only applies to the defenseless common man who is a victim of statism. But it doesn't apply to the wealthy and the powerful. If anyone truly believes in freedom, he or she should be an anarchist rather than a libertarian. Section 8. Legal loopholes. Could these be the keys to loan forgiveness? But wait, there's a glimmer of hope. Remember all those fancy legal terms I mentioned earlier? Well, some legal eagles out there believe they might hold the key to unlocking student loan freedom. We're talking about concepts like discharge of contract, impossibility of performance, frustration of purpose, and commercial impracticability. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but these terms basically boil down to this. If the terms of your student loan agreement were fundamentally unfair, oppressive, or unconscionable, if you were misled about the value of your education, or if the whole system is so rigged against you that it's impossible to succeed, then you should have the right to have your promissory notes terminated. After all, promissory notes are just contracts. Contracts are terminated all the time. The only reason that student loans can't be terminated is because Congress has given student loan creditors special economic protection. Another loophole for relief stems from the fact that, under the Internal Revenue Code, the term qualified education loan is defined as any indebtedness incurred to pay qualified higher education expenses on behalf of the taxpayer's spouse, or any dependent of the taxpayer. The term qualified higher education expenses is further defined as the cost of attendance at an eligible educational institution. Suffice it to say, the Bankruptcy Code only precludes the discharge of student loan debt acquired for the cost of attendance. Neither of these definitions preclude the discharge of interest on student loan debt. Section 9. The government giveth, and the government should forgiveth. Let's be real for a second. The government played a major role in creating this student loan mess. They incentivized lending, looked the other way while colleges hiked up tuition, and generally created an environment where taking on massive amounts of debt for an education became the norm. The primary benefactor of our indoctrination was the government itself. You can't get blood from a turnip. In every other situation, the government wanted to play a paternalistic role, exercising complete control over our lives. However, when the American people need help, the government suddenly wants to disown its children. In the case of the American people, the DNA test confirms that you are the father. Unless the government plans to get into the business of chopping off people's fingers, the government needs to come up with a solution. The government created the problem. So, it stands to reason that the government should also play a major role in fixing it. We need comprehensive student loan forgiveness programs, sensible regulations for lenders and colleges, and a complete overhaul of the bankruptcy system to make it fair for everyone. Section 10. The Student Borrower Bankruptcy Relief Act of 2024. A new hope? Speaking of fixing the system, have you heard about the Student Borrower Bankruptcy Relief Act of 2024? This little ray of sunshine is making its way through Congress right now, and it has the potential to change the game for millions of borrowers. It's called the Student Borrower Bankruptcy Relief Act of 2024. Under this bill, Congress would eliminate the requirement that borrowers prove undue hardship to have their student loan debt discharged in bankruptcy court. This act would make it easier to discharge student loans in bankruptcy, bringing us closer to that uniform standard the Founding Fathers intended. If passed, this law could eliminate the economic protection which was given to student loan creditors in the first place. Section 11. Epilogue. The fight for a fairer future. The fight for student loan reform is far from over. It's going to take continued pressure on lawmakers, widespread public awareness, and maybe even a few more viral rants from yours truly to make a real difference. But I'm confident that together we can create a future where the freedom to earn a livelihood and to enter into private contracts is a right, not a privilege reserved for the wealthy or the deeply indebted. So let's keep fighting the good fight, my friends, because nobody deserves to be crushed under the weight of student loan debt. After all, we're supposed to be the land of opportunity, not the land of indentured servitude by the Department of Education.